Thanks for the introduction. So I am, generally speaking, someone who's interested in the ways in which threat and risk influence Americans' attitudes, but for the last couple of years, I've been working with colleagues in Norway, Finland, Spain, and France looking at how the average citizens and the public's response to terrorist attacks influences things like societal resilience, trust in other people. I joked from this project, I have a chapter in this book that Lou and Catherine co-edited on overcoming intractable conflicts. I'm not particularly good at telling you how to overcome conflict. I can tell you how conflict influences the public, though. Okay, so this project starts in 2015, looking at basically two major events that are interacting to influence public's attitudes. And here I'm going to be talking about the role of the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015 and how those terrorist attacks influence the public's concerns about terrorism, their fear of terrorism, and how that influenced later their immigration attitudes. Okay, so this is the major themes that we're talking about today. This project has lots of different components of it. There's some work on interpersonal trust and government trust. Here we're going to be talking about trust in groups, and I'm going to be talking about immigration attitudes. That's the piece that I'm going to be talking about today. I will say this is, again, joint work with colleagues at the Institute for Social Research in Norway, and it is funded by the Norwegian Research Council. Okay, so in the kind of last couple of years, we have seen both major and minor terrorist attacks in Europe, from the Charlie Hebdo attacks to smaller but important attacks in Orlando, and so in the U.S. as well. So I will say I'm the kind of the U.S. part of this project. I've been kind of pretending that I know something about comparative politics for the last couple of years. Basically, I came onto this project to look at attitudes in the U.S., but today I'm going to be presenting the attitudes across the 5 countries in our sample. Okay, so we have seen this kind of growth of more small scale, but more smaller scale, but more recurrent terrorism in mostly in Europe, but also in the US. Okay, so there's the Brussels attack and the Paris attacks in 2015. And at the same time that we're seeing this kind of terrorist activity in Europe, mostly perpetrated by ISIS, but not solely, we're also seeing the largest mass migration of people since World War II into Europe. We have more than 1 million refugees and immigrants living in Europe, many of whom have come from the Middle East. These refugees tend to be ethnically and religiously distinct from the majority native populations, which we know in these host countries has created a lot of consternation. Right-wing populism is one of the kind of outgrowths of this mass migration. I will not be, the talk really isn't about populism, but it is about immigration attitudes. And we know that immigration plays a large role in the American presidential campaign in 2016 and continually in the US in Brexit discussions, in this discussion of populism in Europe. So we have these two things going on at the same time, and we're interested in this project and how they are related. Yeah.
1 million, you say? I thought 1 million was the number that Germany received, like in 2014 to 17.
Yeah, so there's more than 1 million, right? But we're talking about like many millions of people, right? Okay. Thanks for the clarification. Okay. And so these two phenomena don't necessarily have to be related. So I want to be clear that the kind of association between terrorism and immigration does not actually have to be made. But there are elites, there are people who have incentives to make these connections between them. One of those people is our current president, right? In December 2015, Donald Trump calls for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the US until our country's representatives can figure out what's going on, right, after a terrorist attack. Right, and this is a policy he attempts to implement 3 times after actually becoming president, finally kind of successfully doing it the 3rd time around. Okay, So I want to back up and think a little bit about how the threats from terrorism might be influencing people's attitudes in the mass public about immigration. Again, our focus here is on the mass public. Our expectation is, not surprisingly, that threats from terrorism might increase worries about terrorism. It's not always the case that when people see threat, they then respond with worry, but we do expect that when the threats are from terrorism, when they include potential bodily harm, that people do become more worried about terrorism. We do expect that those terrorism fears increase support for policies that people believe will protect them. That's from previous work of mine and others, that those policies that people believe will increase their security are the ones that they want when they are feeling vulnerable, right? And that elites have made the connection for people that, again, immigration on its own is not particularly popular in the US and in Europe, and that even less so when it is tied to security issues. That when people are told that immigrants are the problem, immigrants are making you less safe, we believe that those terrorism fears can undercut support of immigration. And again, when those immigrants are seen as more threatening on a cultural, economic level. We also expect that terrorism may, through this fear mechanism, decrease trust in outgroups, which is related, again, to immigration. Okay. We might expect that threat may have differential effects on the political identities of respondents. We know that conservatives, and these are right-wing people in Europe and conservatives in the US, are more skeptical of immigration and outgroups to begin with. We know that from work in psychology. And it also may be the case that conservatives are more sensitive to threat to begin with, okay? We also know, and this is some work in Norway and in the UK, that threat can also induce a motivation to control prejudice. That is, for liberals, threat might induce them to want to live up to what their liberal ideals are and motivate them to then tamp down on whatever prejudice they might hold toward outgroups and immigrants. Okay, so it is potentially the case that the threat from terrorism might not undercut immigration attitudes among all people. It might influence conservatives more than liberals. That's a potential. We actually don't find that to be the case, but we think that is potential. Okay, so how do we assess these hypotheses? We have, so I'll walk you through the survey data because it's a lot of data. We have a 5-country survey. So we have respondents from Norway, Finland, France, Spain, and the US. These respondents, we get them in 2015, right a month after the Paris attacks. Okay. This is through Gallup's online survey panel, so all of these respondents are taking the survey online in their native language. So we, as a group, came up with a survey design that was then translated into native languages by the PIs, the co-PIs who were from that country. Okay, so we have both a cross-section and a panel component of this. So we have 7,800 respondents across these 5 countries. I'm going to talk about why these 5 countries in just a second. And then in 2017, we went back to 2,300 of those respondents across the 5 countries. And then we have a new cross-section of 7,800 respondents, okay? So we have in total about 18,000 respondents, and we have questions for them about their fear about immigration, things like their media use, how much they were paying attention to the Paris attacks, lots of questions about immigration and integration, and some questions about trust. Okay, so this is a comparative project, and there is variation across these countries, both at the baseline on their interpersonal and government trust, and also on whether or not they've experienced what we would call exogenous terrorism. So all of these countries, Norway, Finland, France, Spain, and the US, have experienced what my Norwegian colleagues like to call disruptive events, some of which are from exogenous Islamic fundamentalist groups, so Spain, France, and the US, and some of which are domestic terrorism, right-wing terrorism in Norway and Finland, okay? The reason, one, you should know the Norwegian Research Council is funding this, so that's why Norway is here. But Norway provides this really interesting case study as to responses to terrorism to the 2011 Breivik attack are very interesting and very different than what you see across these other countries. That trust in institutions and trust in interpersonal trust actually goes up after this attack. And so it may be that interpersonal trust and kind of social capital, it provides this prophylactic response that both keeps fear at bay and then also influences other attitudes. That is a hypothesis we have about why this kind of comparison across these, what is essentially two groups of countries. France was not originally, quite honestly, France was not originally a part of this project. It became a part because of events on the ground, that once the Paris attacks, we were already interested in terrorism, but once we had this impetus of this event, we add France. And France is a lot more like Spain and the US in both government interpersonal trust and in their responses to terrorism, okay? But it might also be the case that once fearful, respondents behave the same across all these countries, which is actually what we find. Okay, so are you guys okay with seeing this? I can't tell if there's a glare on the board. Okay, all right. So I'm going to show, we ask respondents to tell us how worried they are about terrorism on two questions on both so just as a reminder, the 2015 is a month after the Paris attacks and 2017 is about 13 months later, okay? So we ask respondents across all these 5 countries how worried you are about you or your family member becoming a victim of a terrorist attack and your country becoming a victim of a terrorist attack. I've just scaled these from 0 to 1, where 1 means I'm very worried, 0 means I'm not worried at all. And we ask that, and I just average across those 2 questions, and then I'm just showing you what the averages are per country across these 2 time periods, right? So the circles here are 2017, and the diamonds are 2015, and over here on the right is higher levels of worry. Okay, so there's 2 things to take here. Okay, one is that the Norway really sticks out from the rest, and Finland too, but really Norway sticks out from the rest as there are overall lower levels of fear, both in 2015, right, and then in 2017. This pattern is also the case that in 2015, right after the Paris attacks, people are more worried about terrorism. It kind of settles down a little bit in 2017. But in Spain, France, and the US, there's high levels of concern about terrorism even 13 months later. And there's not a huge difference between France, the place that actually experienced terrorism, and the US and Spain, which did not directly experience terrorism. Okay? I have some ideas about why Norway and Finland are a little bit less that have to do with the media systems there. But this is just, I want you to hold this in your mind, right? Norway is different. And then Spain, France, and the US are very similar in terms of their levels of fear. So we're right that this terrorist attack increases fear. And I'm just going to show you one of many questions we asked in 2015 about, now, understandably, refugees are a special category of immigrants. We do ask questions both about immigrants and refugees. The patterns are basically the same. Refugees are not very popular, as you might know, among the public. This is a question of whether or not your country should stop accepting refugees, and from 0 to 5, and 5 being I agree strongly. So again, you want to just see that there's some variation here. In France, this is in the 2015 data. That's a very popular sentiment in France that the country should stop accepting refugees. I think it's also worth noting that the 2015 Paris attack was not actually perpetrated by refugees. They were natives who perpetrated the terrorist attack, they had immigrant parents, but they themselves were native French. Okay. So again, Norway sticks out as kind of more supportive of refugees, whereas the US, France, Spain, and Finland are more skeptical. But again, there's not huge differences. France kind of sticks out here. Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through one of these so that you can see the basic pattern. So again, we see that Norway, less fearful, less supportive of halting refugees. And here what I'm looking at is, what is the effect of that fear of terrorism? Again, that's that kind of average across those two measures of terrorism, going from no fear to extreme fear, on your support for a variety of attitudes about immigration, whether or not you want to just tighten immigration. This is a set of questions about Syrian refugees particularly. Do you want to increase them? Okay. Whether or not we have a bunch of questions about immigrant integration, that is, should we make it easier for immigrants to integrate into society? This is about stricter control of refugees. And this is about a bunch of questions that we have on civil liberties about Muslims particularly. So I will say that this, when you look at the data, this turns out to be really a story about immigrants and Muslims particularly. And the effects of terrorism are very much driven by those groups. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this. And the different dots are the effects by country. These are just models of the fear of terrorism on support for all of these policies. We have a bunch of control variables in there for all the things that we know influence attitudes about immigration, education, sector of the your partisan, your ideology. Okay.
How about age?
Age is in there as well.
What's the average age or spectrum?
I mean, they're all adults, so they're all over 18. We do have people up until their 80s, I think. I would have to look. But these are all people who have access and a facility with the internet. So they are weighted to look like representative of the population, but it is true that there's kind of going to be some attrition at the higher ends of age. Okay? So let me just walk you through one of these, because the overall finding is the same regardless of what dependent variable you use. Okay? The more fearful you are about terrorism, the more likely you are to want to support things like control of refugees. Okay? And that doesn't really matter which country you're in. Okay? While Norwegians and Finns are less fearful at the baseline, once you get them up to these higher levels of fear, they look very similar in their immigration and attitudes about integration. They're much less supportive of having Syrian refugees. They all want to tighten immigration, right? Fear of terrorism is it is not the only determinant of immigration attitudes, but it is has a strong impact on making people more skeptical of having immigrants in their country. Okay? So this is just to show you that we might have an expectation, and here you can disregard all of this. Just want you to look at these plots here. These are just coefficients from those same OLS models, and I'm just looking at an interaction between fear and your ideology, and I'm just cutting it on whether you're liberal or conservative. If you go, past me would like to be asking more directly about ideology. We don't have ideology questions, just so we're clear. We ask questions about party preference, and then we had to go back and impute the kind of liberal conservativeness of each party, which we did with the Chapel Hill expert survey. But the basic takeaway, if you look at these plots and just any other plot, is that terrorism fear, these are liberals here, right? I'll just say left wing and right wing because liberal conservative doesn't match quite as well in some of these places. The effects of terrorism fear are very similar. They're not statistically distinguishable among left-wing and right-wing people in the 2015 data. Okay? Left-wing and right-wing people, both influenced by terrorism, and we can't necessarily distinguish the effects of fear on your and your ideology on attitudes. Okay, that's the main takeaway from these somewhat ugly plots here. Okay, so we have panel data, and so one of the nice things about panel data is we can actually look at people over time. Okay, so here I'm just showing you, if you look at the effect of terrorism fear on support for immigration control. This is a question that we have in both waves of the data. We might be concerned that people pick their immigration attitudes and then they adjust their attitudes about their fear of terrorism to match that, right? So just say you already know you don't like immigrants. You're going to, maybe you say, yes, I'm fearful of terrorism and that's why I don't like immigrants. Maybe it could be for any other reason. Our panel data allows us to tease out that a little bit. So we can look at, for people who we have in both ways, that's 2,325 people, we have them in both waves. We can look at their fear of terrorism in 2015 on their 2017 attitudes, okay? And we can see that the effects of fear of terrorism influence whether or not you want to tighten immigration across all 5 countries for 13 months. So that effect of fear of terrorism is pretty long lasting. Okay, it influences your attitudes 13 months later in our 2017 data. If you just look at all our respondents in 2017, panelists and our new cross-section, the influence of fear in 2017 is basically the same. Okay, so again, we have this ability to say the effects of terrorism are to depress people's support for immigrants and immigration, and that lasts for at least 13 months. Okay, I told you we also have questions about trust. So we ask people how much they trust different institutions and then different groups in society, including neighbors and people in your community. We ask them particularly about Christians as a group, Muslims as a group, and immigrants as a group. This is not their own identity. This is their trust in these groups. Okay? Here I'm just, again, with all sorts of controls, looking at the effect of your fear of terrorism on your trust in immigrants as a group, Muslims as a group, and Christians. The overall takeaway is the more fearful you are about terrorism, the less likely you are to say, the less trusting you are of immigrants, the less trusting you are of Muslims as a group, but it has, fear of terrorism has no influence on your trust in Christians. Okay, so it is not the case that fear of terrorism is just depressing kind of trust in other people. It is really depressing trust in immigrants as a group and Muslims. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Okay, all right. So I'm going to tell you about one more thing in the 2017 data, which is one of the things I'm kind of challenged by as I'm writing this up, is in 2017, we don't, so this endogeneity concern is real. That is that people have these immigration attitudes and they kind of adjust their fear correspondingly. One of the ways we can try and get out that is we built an experiment within the 2017 wave. And one of the things that varies across these countries also is the type of terrorist attack that they've experienced, okay? And so in the 2017, we run this experiment where we have respondents read one of 4 news stories. One story is not about terrorism at all. And then if you are in a terrorism condition, we randomize whether or not you read about right-wing terrorism, which is like the kind that they've had in Norway and Finland, or you read about ISIS terrorism. Now, I will say that the article that people read is about a potential terrorist attack in their home country, right, to try and make it relevant to people. It's something along the lines, I can show you the article, that the police or the FBI is very concerned about this group of men, and they have maps, and they look like they have a kind of terrorist plan, and they're at large. And so we vary whether or not that group that they're reading about is a right-wing group that's appropriate for the country, and whether or not the perpetrators are immigrants or they're in the ISIS terrorism or they're native born, but they have Iraqi parents, okay? So this is like a quote, "We have reason to believe the men could be working with Islamic State cells in other cities to attack civilians in one large event, or smaller coordinated events like in Nice and Brussels," right? This is just one snippet of what this is what they read. Okay, I don't expect you to read that. I just want you to see what they saw. Okay? So our expectation, we didn't have strong expectations about which one of these should produce more fear. And as it turns out, just reading about terrorism makes people fearful. Okay, so this is just looking at how angry and how fearful respondents were after they read the stories in 2017. Okay, and this is the control condition here, and these are the 3 terrorism conditions. So it turns out no matter which of the terrorism conditions you read, it made you both angry and fearful. Okay. I would say I look really nice, but like I've spent more than a decade learning how to scare people about terrorism, and I'm pretty good at it at this point. But actually tamping down on their fear is like something I'm still working on. Okay, so here's one of the things that, so they might all become fearful, but maybe one of them is more powerful on people's attitudes than others. And it turns out that's not really the case. So this is, again, just being in this treatment condition, the native-born treatment condition, the refugee, this is a immigrant treatment condition or the right-wing treatment. They all have a small, basically, effect on your trust in Muslims, but it's in the wrong direction. So this makes me very sad because I don't know what's happening, because my expectation was that I produce this, you read this fearful thing about terrorism and it depresses your support for Muslims, as it did in the 2015 data, in the survey data. But as it turns out, here is where we're seeing this interaction between ideology and the treatment condition. And I'm still kind of working out what's happening here. So here, these are just OLS coefficients with fixed effects for country. The baseline country here is Norway. And so I just want to draw your attention to these effects here and those effects here. Okay. So what I'm showing you here is that for respondents who are right-wing, that is, they're kind of on the right wing of the political spectrum across all 5 countries, the treatment of, no matter which treatment effect they had, it had a small negative impact on their trust in Muslims, but it's not significant. Being right-wing on its own, in the control condition, that depresses trust in Muslims. But what seems to be happening here is that we're having offsetting effects, that left-wing people, when they read these terrorism stories, become more trusting of Muslims. And our right-wing people become slightly less trusting, but the effects, the reason that we're seeing this kind of offsetting effect is because we have more left-wing people, right? And they are reacting in this kind of somewhat unusual way. Particularly because in the 2015 data, we don't see any interaction effect of ideology and fear on their attitudes. Okay. This is true no matter whether we look at trust in Christians or trust in immigrants. And so I've been thinking about what's going on here. And I have a couple of potential explanations, one of which I think is most likely. Again, left-wing respondents respond to exposure to any of the terrorism stories by becoming more trusting of basically all groups, right? This is true not just for the trust in Muslims measure, but for all measures. Okay, and right-wing respondents move in the opposite direction by becoming less trusting, but the effects are just much more inconsistent. So here's what I think might be going on. One is that this idea of this motivation to control prejudice is coming back in 2017. With more time away from the event, more time to think, maybe left-wing people think, maybe immigrants aren't such a threat. Maybe I can read this story and I don't have to kind of react by saying we need fewer Muslims or fewer immigrants. Maybe I can kind of use my liberal values, and that's what I should influence. What should influence my attitudes. I have some other ideas. I think this one's the most likely. I've thought about some other ideas about this might be some maintenance of political coalitions. That is, left-wing people are much more likely to be in political coalitions with Muslims and with immigrants than right-wing people are. And so in order to maintain that political coalition, they might just have to say, I don't believe that story. I don't think that's what's going on. Or even if I am fearful about terrorism, I can't take it out on my Muslim brother who is in my political coalition. That's a possibility, okay? It's quite possible that liberals are just not understanding what I'm trying to do. I mean, one thing you can do is just blame your respondents for not understanding what you want to do. I don't think that's what's happening. It's also so possible, and these are related, right? I'm not sure I can parse out what particular mechanism it is that threat has become so politicized since 2015 that liberals might just dismiss, again, left-wing people might just dismiss this kind of terrorism immigration link that they think is trying to be made by elites, okay? So I've given you a lot of data. Happy to take questions and talk more about it, but I just want to leave you with this, right? Fearful publics in 2015 and 2017 want more restrictive immigration, refugee, and integration policies. That's a clear takeaway from the data, right? This affects both non-citizens within these countries and religious minorities. These effects seem to differ a little bit by ideology in the 2017 data. And then again, because this whole project is generally about societal resilience, the question is whether these attitudes help societies to be resilient in the face of threat or become a detriment to democracy. And I think that's an open question. I think I'm on the kind of side of that this is more of a detriment to democracy. But I just want to leave with some kind of big questions about democracy and what is the theoretical contribution here. Okay?